Dr. Mary Kate Hurley. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Hi there. I'm Dr. Hurley, and I teach the Middle Ages broadly in literature. And so part of what I focus on is in my research is Old English, but in particular, I'm interested in the way that translation affects ideas of community. Increasingly, that interest in translation and time, the idea of extending a community in time, has led me to think a bit about medievalism. And one of my two next projects is going to be on medievalism and time.
Excellent. Well, how did you first come to the medieval or the Middle Ages?
So you would think that the answer here would be that I loved Tolkien and I loved fantasy as a kid, and it was just a natural emergence. And to a degree, that is true. I loved Tolkien and I loved King Arthur. T.H. White, totally into that. However, when I got to undergraduate at Wake Forest, I firmly intended to study James Joyce for the rest of my life. And one semester I had to get a pre-1800 requirement out of the way because we had two of them, and I couldn't get into Legends of Arthur because I was only a sophomore. And so I took this weird class called Old English Language and Literature. And there I met this language, Old English, that just was fascinating. And the literature was beautiful and 1,000 years old and spoke across all of that time to me and to the things that I was feeling. I read a poem called The Wanderer in the original language, and the types of loss and exile and sadness and meditations on death and eternity and mortality. It just spoke to me as a 19-year-old college student, and I have never looked back. And then I found out Tolkien was also a medievalist and was very excited.
Well, as a literature professor at OU for a while now, how similar or different do you find the ideas, and what brings students today to the Middle Ages?
I think a few things. Often students have watched Game of Thrones or The Lord of the Rings and thought, gosh, this is really interesting, this world of magic and dragons and knights in shining armor. And they come with a lot of ideas about it and are just interested. But often they find it the same way I did. They need to get a requirement out of the way for the major. And so they walk in and there it is. And often students will assume that what they're walking into is going to be very boring and very dry. Nothing interesting here. And what they find is that it's some of the most vibrant literature that was ever written, and certainly touches on any number of issues of the present day, from gender and sexuality to race and racism, to thinking about any number of both identity categories and ideas about how the world is or should be. So it's really fun to watch students sort of evolve from, I'm here because you put Tolkien in the title of the course, and that sounds less scary, to I really love Norse mythology and want to look at how it's been used in different ways. And so it's been fun to watch that happen.
Yeah. Do you find that there are any notions or preconceptions that students have when they're specifically talking about these issues in relation to the Middle Ages that you feel like really need to be corrected or modified or changed in any way?
There are a few. There's the idea that the period is particularly more violent than the present day, which in some ways it is, and in some ways it very much isn't. I think the one that students may have that in students doesn't have to be harmful and often isn't, but that has been weaponized in popular culture and in the wider world is actually the idea that medieval Europe was a monolithic, monocultural, monolingual, monoracial society. We see with certain white supremacist organizations this idea that the Middle Ages is some kind of homogeneously white world, and that it was the time when Europeans could be proud of their heritage and all of that. And that's absolutely false. It wasn't a monolithically white world. Even the Vikings, which often those are kind of the image that white supremacists will repair to. The Vikings are constantly in contact with different cultures. Ibn Fadlan and the Land of Darkness, for example, talks about how the Viking Rus are met and conversed with by Ibn Fadlan, who's a Baghdadi writer and traveler. And it really, we see silk from China, we see all of these different cultures having contact and really influencing one another in ways that are meaningful and important, and that also make it clear that the Europe, medieval Europe, as conceived by people who want to think of it as a pure white homogenous place, never really existed in that way in the first place. And it's up to all of us, I think, to be more attentive to the ways in which our reflections on the Middle Ages also reflect the complexity and the cultural diversity of the period as well.
Hmm. Well, you mentioned Ibn Fadlan, and as a Old English scholar, of course, you know Beowulf very well, and that makes me wonder what you think about different cinematic attempts at portraying Beowulf on the movie screen or the television screen, whether 13th Warrior or any of them. One of the things that is remarkable to me, how there were almost no like film versions of Beowulf until not that long ago. And now there's quite a few. So what do you make of them? Do
Well,
you recommend any? Do you hate any?
so I actually just finished a freshman seminar on Beowulf's Afterlives that looks at a variety of different adaptations of Beowulf, including a number of cinematic and televisual ones. And boy, do I have thoughts. But part of what I find fascinating, and I should say at the outset, I have terrible taste in Beowulf movies. I actually find most of them fascinating, but by fascinating, I do not mean good. So anytime you hear fascinating, think interesting intellectually, not necessarily a satisfying movie-going experience. What I find in almost all of them, and this is one of the most frustrating aspects of Beowulf movies in general, they all attempt to give Beowulf a love interest, which I find really interesting because when you read the poem, almost everything about Beowulf revolves around the fact that Beowulf doesn't have a love interest. He doesn't get married. He doesn't have an heir. He doesn't secure his kingdom at the end of the poem. And so you end up with this attempt on the part of different directors and writers to sort of inscribe him into a more heteronormative world where he has a wife, a lover, a Grendel's mother in the Zemeckis film, played by Angelina Jolie, which everyone mentions, including me. In the Star Trek Voyager episode Heroes and Demons, the holographic doctor falls in love with a character that's invented as Hrothgar's daughter, Hrothgar does have a daughter in the movie, in the poem, but this is not her. This is a shield maiden, and she's meant to fall in love with the Beowulf character in this holographic adventure. But in any case, every time they create this love interest for him. And what I find interesting about it is it speaks volumes about what we think as modern human beings is important. To us, romance and love and family and all of that is the most important thing. And I'm not saying it wasn't important in the Middle Ages. You know, it was invented in the Middle Ages, like so many other things, courtly love. But in Beowulf in particular, there's a radical aloneness. Beowulf is singular. He is the strongest man on that day of this life, the poem says. We have all of these isolated figures who don't participate in heteronormative relationships. And that moment with Beowulf, recognizing that that's what almost all of the movies try to do, is inscribe him into that sort of a relationship, it really revealed something to me about why people are so uncomfortable with Beowulf, why people don't want him to be alone. And I think it's because contemplating that kind of aloneness makes us look at the choices that he makes a little bit differently. Why does he choose not to secure his kingdom through an heir? Does securing your kingdom through an heir even work? Because it doesn't for Hrothgar. We're told that in one of the many digressions in the poem. So I mean, that's probably the number one thing. Now, in terms of adaptations of Beowulf, my absolute favorite is an 8-minute, maybe 10-minute short film by Brigham Young University Animation called Grendel. Highly recommend it. It won awards and all of this. It was student animation. It's gorgeous, but it's this beautiful meditation on Grendel, who's just living his life when suddenly these Vikings show up. And it bears very little resemblance to the story that we know. There is no real Beowulf character, but Grendel is a furry, purple, kind of dragony looking thing who bakes cookies. That's very important to the story. But it's really quite lovely. There's no dialogue. It really relies on certain visual cues and certain sound cues to show us the relationships between the different characters and how Grendel is meant to be perceived. So that's one that I would highly, highly recommend. And I think it's actually good. Whereas the other ones I would highly, highly recommend, like, for example, well, the Voyager episode, I'm pretty sure it's extremely bad based on what my students tell me, but I still like it.
Oh, that's great. And then there's also there's I think more than one graphic novel adaptation.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And it made me wonder, like, I guess obviously you like movies, and so do I, and I also like pretty much all Beowulf movies in that weird way that you do. Is there a favorite form of popular media besides movies that you enjoy that has some sort of medieval aspect to it?
One of the things I love doing is reading novelizations of different medieval stories. So, for example, a few years ago, Nicola Griffith wrote a beautiful book called Hild, and it's about the abbess Hild, who was the head of a noble monastery in early medieval England, and the work that she did as that abbess. And it's highly fictionalized. It's imagining her world in a lot of ways. But it's really quite beautiful. And getting that kind of insight can be really lovely, just to spend time in a more fully fleshed out version of a story that we know only because Bede decided to devote a chapter of it, and then completely sideline her from the rest of her own history in a certain way. So that's one that I love. I love Maria Debona Headley's The Muir Wife, which is an adaptation of Beowulf into a novel set in suburbia. And it is absolutely brilliant. She does something with the mother-in-laws that turns them into a kind of Greek chorus that's just absolutely brilliant. And it's a really sensitive portrayal of everything from PTSD to racialization and otherness. That's just really, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous book. Yeah, no, I love, and of course, everyone loves John Gardner's Grendel, in part because you can still discover things about it on the 15th or 16th or 20th time you read it. There's just these little things that he does, and in that way it reminds me a lot of the poem, because the poem will have these half lines that you never notice until one day you do, and it's like they just come out of nowhere. And this semester, thanks in part to a student, one of the things I noticed was the way that he was using italics throughout the novel to collapse different characters, and that was something that one of my students pointed out that I'd never noticed that was happening, and it's brilliant. I hope that the student does something with that paper, actually, because it's really cool. It's a good idea. So yeah, I love the novels about medieval. I've actually written an essay on the Elder Scroll V Skyrim, which is one of the Elder Scrolls series that it's set in Skyrim, which is a northern part of the world, Tamriel. I know way too much about this now, but one of the things that it uses is a lot of sort of Viking ideas, and that's what initially drew me to it. But what I really ended up finding fascinating was the way that it used ideas of a kind of fictionalized idea of indigeneity. Um, who is indigenous? Who gets to claim this land as their rightful home from the beginning of time, the dawn of the world, I believe is what one of the characters says. And it becomes very complex very quickly because, like everyone, the reason that I play video games is to read the books that are in them. And so when you start to read the books and you start to look at the histories that are sort of layered in there, the sort of this fight over Skyrim and this sort of like large idea of imperialism and fighting back against imperialism, it's layered over another kind of colonization that the Nords, the Viking culture in this, actually participated in themselves, that displaced the original inhabitants of Skyrim. And so it's a really interesting move that the game designers made, but it's one that most players won't access because they just play the lines that they're given, and unless they go looking for these stories, unless they really delve into the history, it's all hidden in the books. So of course that's what I spent my time doing, running around Skyrim, ignoring dragons and reading books, kind of like my real life.
Well, I love interviews that give me things to add to my reading list. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you taking the time to do this. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.